I've always loved my backyard. Not just because it's mine, but because it's the one corner of the world where I get to forget about HOA rules, neighborly politics, and the endless parade of complaints that seem to define suburban life. My pool sparkles under the afternoon sun, perfectly clean, perfectly blue, perfectly mine, or so I thought. It all started innocently enough. I was lounging on my deck one Saturday morning, sipping my coffee, when I heard laughter echoing over the fence. At first, I assumed it was my friends from across the street, but when I looked closer, I froze. There she was, Karen, the self-proclaimed ruler of our HOA, wearing a pink polo that probably cost more than my entire backyard furniture set. And behind her, like little ducks following a tyrant, were her husband and her 2 teenage kids, wading into my pool like it was a public water park. "Morning," she called out, waving as if she hadn't just crossed into private property without so much as a "may I." I coughed, trying to keep my voice calm. Good morning, Karen. This is, my pool, private property." She laughed, that infuriating, nasal laugh that sounds like a trumpet slowly dying in a marching band. "Oh, don't be silly, we're neighbors. What's the big deal? It's just a swim." I wanted to point out that just a swim doesn't include barbecues, pool floats shaped like unicorns, or screaming teenagers cannonballing off the deep end. But before I could get a word out, her son cannonballed directly into the shallow end, spraying water like a fire hydrant on a hot July day. I wiped my glasses and tried again. "Karen, seriously, I keep this pool for me and my family, you can't." "Relax," she said, cutting me off, tucking her perfectly manicured hands behind her head. "We're not going to stay long, just a quick dip." I wanted to grab a megaphone and scream, "You are literally on my property, using my pool without permission." But I didn't. Instead, I smiled tightly, the kind of smile that feels like it's holding back a storm. By the time they finally left, dripping and laughing, I was packing my deck, muttering under my breath like a lunatic. This can't be real. She just waded into my pool like it belonged to her family's HOA kingdom. But it wasn't over. Oh no, that was only the beginning. The next weekend, the same scene played out. Karen's kids were back, this time with a set of pool noodles, a giant inflatable flamingo, and the full soundtrack of 2000s pop blaring from a waterproof speaker. And Karen, she didn't even knock. She didn't even wave. She just strutted in, like a general inspecting enemy lines, and began directing her family like it was some military operation. At this point, neighbors were starting to notice. I caught Mr. from next door giving me a sympathetic nod as he watered his hydrangeas. "I've never seen anyone just waltz in like that," he whispered when Karen wasn't looking. It wasn't just the intrusion. It was the audacity. The sheer unmitigated gall of thinking my pool, my backyard, my sanctuary was open to Karen's royal court. And somehow, every time I thought about it, a little part of me laughed. Not because it was funny, well okay, a little because it was, but mostly because I realized I couldn't just let this slide. So I started watching. I paid attention. Their schedules, their little routines. I noticed that they always came mid-morning, right when the sun hit the pool at the perfect angle to blind me while I was sipping my coffee. I began imagining ways to reclaim my territory, little surprises that would make them think twice before just strolling in again. But I didn't act immediately. That would be a rookie mistake. No, I needed patience. I needed timing. I needed a plan so flawless, so perfectly executed, that Karen would never forget the day my pool became my kingdom again. And as I stood on my deck that night, staring at the still, calm water that had somehow become both my pride and my battlefield, I smiled. Quietly, subtly, because I knew one thing for sure, this wasn't the last time Karen's family would visit. But next time, it wouldn't just be a swim. It would be a lesson. And I was ready. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just bad luck. Maybe Karen's family had a weekend swim tradition I somehow didn't know about. But by the third Saturday in a row, I had to face the uncomfortable truth. They were treating my pool like a public amenity, and apparently, I was just the silent lifeguard. I started noticing the patterns. They didn't just show up, they arrived like clockwork. Around 10 in the morning, Karen's SUV would roll into the driveway, tires crunching against the gravel, and she would step out, perfectly coiffed, sunglasses reflecting the sun as if she owned the block. Behind her, her kids would be bounding like caffeinated gazelles, towels flapping in the wind. And her husband, bless him, would shuffle along like a sheepdog, following orders without question. It got to the point where I could predict exactly how the day would unfold. Karen would inspect the pool chemicals. Yes, actually inspect them, like she had some kind of HOA-certified chemistry degree. Then her kids would start splashing, screaming, and pretending the shallow end was a theme park ride. And me? I was stuck on my deck, holding a cup of coffee, wondering if life had suddenly become a reality show. I tried diplomacy. I left polite notes. Dear Karen, my pool is private property. Please do not use it without permission. That note lasted all of 5 minutes before it was buried under a pile of floaties on the edge of the pool. I tried knocking on the door and asking nicely, Hey Karen, could you, not use my pool today? She smiled sweetly, that infuriatingly saccharine grin, and replied, Oh, don't worry, we're neighbors, sharing is caring. As if my electricity and water bills were optional contributions to her weekend fun. Even my friends started noticing. I hosted a barbecue one evening, and as I recounted the latest escapade, my buddy Mike nearly spit out his beer laughing. Dude, you're basically a live-action HOA reality show, he said. And he wasn't wrong. Except in this show, I was trapped as the unwitting victim, and Karen's family was the cast of chaos I hadn't auditioned for. I began keeping a mental log of their visits. Saturdays at 10, Tuesdays if they were bored, random weekday mornings, just to check the water temperature. I even started noticing subtle signs before they arrived, the faint scent of sunscreen wafting over the fence, the sound of an SUV door shutting, the click of pool toys being unloaded. It was like I was living in a suspense movie, except the villain wore pastel polos and wielded an inflatable flamingo. But here's the thing. While all of this was infuriating, it also got me thinking about control, about boundaries, about how someone could just assume your property is theirs without consequence. And then, just as the frustration peaked, a dangerous little idea crept into my head. Maybe I didn't have to just stand there and watch anymore. I started scheming, not in a malicious way, well, maybe a little, but in a smart, calculated way. I wanted to reclaim my backyard. I wanted Karen and her family to realize, without me having to yell, that my pool was not, in fact, their personal amusement park. But I had to be careful. I couldn't just do something impulsive and end up on the wrong side of HOA law or local ordinances. No, this had to be perfect. I experimented subtly at first. One weekend, I set up a small surprise in the form of a harmless sprinkler along the edge of the pool, just enough to make the water dance in unusual patterns. Karen's kids laughed hysterically at first, oblivious to the fact that I was watching their reactions, trying to gauge the perfect level of chaos. Karen, naturally, took it as a sign that I was joining the fun. But I was, not yet. This was reconnaissance, testing the waters, literally and figuratively. I was mapping their behavior, noting the exact moments when Karen would relax, when her kids would get overconfident, and when her husband would be distracted by a phone call. Every little detail mattered. And as the weeks went on, it became clear that Karen's family didn't just like my pool, they expected it. They assumed it. And that assumption, that sense of entitlement, would be their undoing. By the end of that second month, I was ready, not yet to act but to set the stage. I started planning my little surprise, something that would be perfectly timed, perfectly executed, and perfectly unforgettable. Something that would teach them a lesson without crossing the line, something that would let me reclaim my backyard once and for all. And as I stood on my deck one evening, watching the sunlight shimmer off the calm, pristine water, I smiled. Calmly, quietly. Because I knew that soon, very soon, the days of Karen's family waltzing into my pool uninvited were numbered. Little did they know, I had been watching, learning, and preparing. And when the time came, they wouldn't just be surprised, they wouldn't know what hit them. By the time I reached the third month of Karen's family's uninvited pool parties, I'd learned a few things. Patience was my ally, timing was everything, and Karen had an ego the size of her pastel pink SUV. But more importantly, I realized that if I wanted to reclaim my backyard without turning it into a full-blown HOA war zone, I had to get creative. I spent a few nights packing the deck, notebook in hand, jotting down every little habit I'd noticed. Karen's son always ran straight to the deep end first. Her daughter had a habit of knocking over my pool floats and leaving them half-submerged like tiny casualties. And Karen would always insist on checking the water temperature at least 3 times, making exaggerated faces of shock if it was even a degree off from her imaginary ideal. I began to map it all out, like some suburban military strategist preparing for the ultimate showdown. I needed a plan that would be subtle enough to avoid legal trouble, but dramatic enough to make them think twice about trespassing. I wasn't looking for revenge in the mean-spirited sense, I just wanted them to respect boundaries. First, I thought about setting up cameras. Not in a creepy Big Brother kind of way, but enough to track their comings and goings and make sure I could document any future trespassing. While I set them up, I caught myself chuckling at the thought. HOA Karen, you've just become part of my science experiment. Next came the brainstorming for the actual surprise. I wanted something harmless but highly effective, something that would make them pause mid-splash and maybe reconsider the audacity of using my pool like it was a communal HOA amenity. My ideas ranged from the ridiculous to the clever: inflatable sharks, too juvenile; a sudden cold water blast, too cruel. Then it hit me, a little harmless mischief with a dash of theatrical flair. Something that would catch them off guard, make them laugh nervously, and respect my pool at the same time. I started gathering materials. Nothing illegal, nothing damaging, just a few well-placed sprinklers, a harmless but shocking chemical effect that made the water sparkle unusually, harmless pool-safe crystals, and strategically placed noisemakers that would announce my presence without me ever leaving my deck. All of it would be triggered at precise moments, like a carefully choreographed suburban fireworks display. But the real key was timing. I knew I couldn't just unleash it at the wrong moment. I needed them to be fully immersed, completely overconfident, and utterly oblivious. Karen's son would have to be doing his cannonball dives, her daughter chasing the unicorn float, and Karen herself pretending she was casually checking the water, exactly as she always did. Only then would my little surprise have maximum impact. I also started rehearsing my own reactions. How would I watch them? When would I step in? How would I make it look like pure coincidence, a funny twist of fate, and not a meticulously planned setup? This part was almost more important than the setup itself. After all, if I appeared too gleeful, too satisfied, it would ruin the subtlety of the lesson. The neighbors were unknowingly my allies. Mr. Across the street would sometimes water his flowers, conveniently positioned to be a witness to any potential chaos. My friend Mike offered unsolicited suggestions over beers. Dude, make it a water explosion. Nah, make it subtle but unforgettable. Little did they know, every detail was already in motion. As the plan took shape, I felt a mix of excitement and nervous anticipation. I couldn't act yet. Karen was unpredictable, and acting too soon could backfire. Instead, I refined the triggers, the timing, and the placement of my harmless surprise. I imagined the look on her face when the water shimmered unexpectedly, the startled squeals from her kids, and the awkward scramble to exit the pool gracefully. And while I plotted, I couldn't help but admire the irony. Here was Karen, always policing everyone else's backyard behavior, always dictating the rules for the neighborhood, and yet blissfully unaware that she was about to become the unwitting star of my little suburban drama. By the end of that week, everything was in place. My backyard was quiet, pristine, and calm, but beneath the surface, literally and figuratively, the stage was set. All that remained was the right moment. One perfect, unsuspecting Saturday morning when Karen and her family would waltz into my pool for the last time, thinking they were the rulers of my backyard. And I would be ready. Because this wasn't just about fun or revenge, This was about reclaiming my space, my sanctuary, my pool. And Karen, she had no idea what was coming. Saturday morning arrived like any other, or so Karen thought. The sun was just beginning to cast that golden, teasing light over my backyard, and my pool shimmered perfectly, pristine and calm, hiding the chaos I had carefully planted beneath its surface. I felt a rush of anticipation, a thrill that made my coffee taste sharper than usual. Today was the day I would finally tip the scales. I'd spent the previous week making subtle adjustments, almost like a director preparing a stage for an unsuspecting cast. The sprinklers were hidden among the lounge chairs and potted plants. The harmless shimmering crystals were scattered just so in the water, and small noisemakers, disguised as pool toys, were set to activate at just the right moments. Every detail had been rehearsed in my mind a dozen times. Timing was everything. As I stood on my deck, scanning the quiet street, I could see her SUV creeping down the block. Karen was behind the wheel, sunglasses on, her posture immaculate as always. And of course, behind her, like obedient little soldiers, came her kids, towels flapping, pool noodles in hand. I tried not to grin too wide, but I couldn't help it. They pulled into my driveway exactly on schedule. Karen stepped out, stretching, as if she were performing a ritual in front of an audience. Her children charged ahead, already halfway into their imaginary water amusement park. Her husband lingered slightly behind, looking a bit apprehensive but dutifully following orders. I raised my cup of coffee, casually, pretending to enjoy the morning while secretly monitoring their every movement. Karen approached the pool, hands on her hips, inspecting the water like she was about to grade a final exam. I could practically hear the gears turning in her head. Am I allowed to do this? Probably. Do I care? Absolutely not. The kids immediately jumped in, splashing and screaming, and I felt that familiar mix of irritation and amusement. But this time, I didn't shout, I didn't wave, I didn't intervene. I simply waited. Every sprinkler, every crystal, every hidden noisemaker was armed and ready. The stage was set. Karen's inspection of the pool was meticulous, her nose wrinkling as she tapped the water with her perfectly manicured fingers. "Oh, a little chilly today," she murmured, her voice dripping with false concern, before beckoning her children closer for a group cannonball. They enthusiastically, oblivious to the tension building like an unseen storm beneath the surface. I shifted slightly on my deck, my hand hovering near the remote trigger I'd rigged for the noisemakers. I could hear the soft click of buttons in my mind as if rehearsing a symphony. Sprinkle here, shimmer there, a gentle pop at the edge of the pool. Perfect timing, maximum effect. And then it began. A subtle shimmer flickered across the water, catching the morning sun in a way that made it sparkle unnaturally. Karen froze, tilting her head in confusion. "What?" she muttered. Her kids paused mid-splash, eyebrows raised. The first noisemaker popped quietly, a harmless but startling squeak that sounded like a miniature trumpet. Her husband jumped, looking around for the source, bewildered. The sprinklers activated next, sending thin, arcing streams of water that glimmered in the sunlight. The kids shrieked, ducking and laughing, while Karen tried to maintain composure, shielding herself with one hand and squinting suspiciously at me. "What is going on?" she demanded, her voice a mix of confusion and irritation. I smiled innocently, lifting my coffee cup as if to toast the morning. "I guess the pool wanted to welcome you properly," I said, voice casual, hiding the glee bubbling underneath. She took a step closer, trying to inspect the sprinklers. I could see her frustration mounting, her perfectly styled hair now damp from the spray. Her kids, meanwhile, had completely lost their composure, laughing hysterically and dodging the water. Even her husband couldn't keep a straight face, shaking his head as he muttered something about this backyard being cursed. I watched, heart racing, as the chaos unfolded exactly as I had envisioned. Every glance, every startled reaction, every splash of water played out like a scene from a carefully directed movie. The thrill wasn't in hurting them, it was in reclaiming my space, in asserting, subtly but undeniably, that this backyard was mine. And as Karen waved her arms dramatically, trying to maintain authority over the unpredictable chaos, I realized something crucial: the surprise had worked. They were no longer in control. The pool, my pool, had become its own force, unpredictable and untouchable. And for the first time, Karen and her family were playing by my rules, even if they didn't know it yet. I took a sip of my coffee, letting the satisfaction sink in. The stage was set, the plan was in motion, and the suspense, the real juicy part, was just beginning. Karen had no idea how long this little surprise could last, how perfectly timed, harmless but unforgettable it would be. And I, watching from my deck, knew I held all the cards. Because in this suburban war of wits and water, I wasn't just defending my property. I was creating a story, one splash at a time. The chaos didn't stop, it escalated. Karen's kids were shrieking with laughter, darting across the pool, splashing in every direction. Their cannonballs had turned into half-panicked attempts to avoid the streams of water shooting from every angle. And Karen, well, she was trying, desperately trying, to maintain her composure. Her sunglasses were slightly askew, her pink polo damp, her perfectly coiffed hair sticking out at awkward angles. Every movement she made looked like she was conducting an orchestra, except the instruments had minds of their own. I stayed on my deck, coffee in hand, trying to appear calm while secretly thrilled. The sprinklers danced, the harmless shimmer made the water sparkle unnaturally, and the little noisemakers popped at exactly the right moments. I had never felt more like a suburban puppet master. Karen's husband, bless him, finally cracked. He tried to corral the kids, holding out his arms like a lifeguard in a nightmare scenario. All right, let's take a break," he shouted, but the kids ignored him entirely, diving under the sprinklers, shrieking with gleeful chaos. Even he had no idea what to make of the situation. And Karen, oh Karen. She tried to sound authoritative, but the desperation in her voice was palpable. I don't understand," she sputtered, waving her arms as if that could somehow wrest control of the pool from me and my little surprise. Why is this happening?" I raised an eyebrow innocently. "Maybe the pool just wanted to play too," I suggested, keeping my tone light, casual, like this was a perfectly normal Saturday morning activity. Her glare could have melted glass. I could feel the tension radiating over the fence, a mix of frustration, embarrassment, and the faint realization that maybe, just maybe, this backyard wasn't hers to command. The neighbors started to notice, too. Mr. from across the street had come out to water his hydrangeas, and even he couldn't hide his chuckle as Karen flailed helplessly while her kids laughed uncontrollably. I could see him shaking his head and whispering, "Finally, some poetic justice." Karen's daughter, the middle instigator, tripped over an errant pool float, squealing in mock outrage while simultaneously laughing. It was perfect. Every reaction, every startled jump, every flailing arm was exactly what I'd envisioned. This was the lesson I'd been planning for weeks, the subtle, harmless, unforgettable reminder that my pool was not a free-for-all. The real kicker came when Karen tried to step forward and regain control. She reached toward one of the sprinklers, clearly intending to turn it off, and in doing so, triggered another hidden device I'd set up. A gentle burst of water hit her squarely in the shoulder, spraying across her pink polo and leaving her momentarily stunned. She froze, dripping, eyes wide, and for a second, everything was silent except for the soft hum of the sprinklers and the occasional squeak from a noisemaker. Then the kids erupted into laughter again, breaking the silence like a storm. Karen's husband muttered something under his breath about losing control of the situation, and I had to fight the urge to laugh outright. I took a step back, coffee in hand, pretending to be an innocent bystander enjoying the morning sun. "Careful, it might be contagious," I said, nodding toward the water, as if the pool itself had become a mischievous entity. Karen finally managed to regain her voice, though it trembled slightly. I don't know what to say," she exclaimed, glancing helplessly at her kids, who were now drenched, gleeful, and completely unruly. This is ridiculous." And that's when it hit me. This wasn't about humiliating them. It wasn't about revenge in a mean-spirited sense. It was about setting boundaries, about reclaiming my property, about showing, in the most dramatic and memorable way possible, that my backyard was mine, and if they wanted to enjoy it, it would be on my terms. I let the sprinklers run a little longer, timing it so they would be soaked, startled, and thoroughly disoriented, but never unsafe, never out of control. The chaos was controlled, orchestrated with precision. Karen's family might have thought they were ruling the backyard, but the reality was simple. I was in charge. By the time the sprinklers finally shut off, the shimmering crystals still sparkled in the sunlight, making the pool look like it was sprinkled with fairy dust. The kids were laughing and panting, Karen was glaring, and her husband was shaking his head in a mixture of amusement and disbelief. I took a final sip of my coffee, smiling quietly to myself. The first reaction was exactly what I had hoped for. They were startled, humbled, and most importantly, aware that their assumption of entitlement had consequences. And as I watched them gather their towels and leave, I knew the story wasn't over. Karen's glare promised a subtle but inevitable retaliation, one that I would be ready for. Because this suburban war was far from finished. And the best part, the suspense, the delicious uncertainty of what would happen next, was only just beginning. The following Saturday, I could feel the tension in the air even before Karen's SUV rolled down the street. The previous week's events had left their mark. I noticed her kids glancing nervously at each other, as if wondering what new surprise awaited them. And Karen, well, her posture was slightly more rigid, her sunglasses perched higher on her nose, her pink polo somehow a shade less defiant. I had spent the week fine-tuning my setup, making sure this full reveal would be unforgettable, but still harmless. The sprinklers were repositioned for maximum effect, subtle water streams aimed just right to make anyone in the pool think it had a mind of its own. The shimmering crystals I had added earlier were now enhanced with a harmless, biodegradable sparkle that caught the sunlight in dazzling, almost magical patterns. Even the noisemakers were upgraded. Tiny, harmless pops and soft whistles that triggered at random, creating the illusion that the pool itself was alive. By mid-morning, the scene was set. I lounged on my deck with my coffee, watching as Karen's SUV parked with clinical precision. Her kids jumped out, bouncing with energy, while Karen strutted toward the pool, clipboard in hand, like she was about to give a water inspection seminar. Her husband trailed behind, resigned yet cautiously optimistic that this time maybe things would go smoother. They had no idea what was coming. As soon as Karen stepped onto the deck, the sprinklers activated in perfect timing. Streams of water arced gracefully through the air, catching the sunlight in flashes of liquid brilliance. Her kids shrieked, diving and ducking as if the pool had suddenly become a jungle river. Karen's first reaction was a combination of shock and outrage. She squinted, flapped her arms, and shouted, "I don't understand, why is this?" Then came the sparkle. The crystals scattered across the pool caught the sunlight and refracted it in dazzling bursts, making the water shimmer like a scene out of a movie. Karen blinked repeatedly, as if trying to convince herself it was an optical illusion. Her children laughed uncontrollably, their energy reaching a new crescendo. Even her husband had to shake his head, muttering, I can't, this is insane." I pressed a small remote, activating the noisemakers. Tiny, perfectly timed pops echoed across the pool, sounding like soft, mischievous trumpets announcing my presence. Karen's glare could have burned through concrete. She stomped toward the sprinklers, attempting to turn them off, only to trigger another harmless burst of water directly onto her shoes. Her kids squealed in delight, and even the husband gave a little chuckle, caught between sympathy and amusement. It was perfect. Every reaction I had anticipated, the shock, the embarrassment, the helpless laughter, was happening exactly as planned. Karen's family had lost control. My pool had become the star, and they were merely participants in a drama they didn't see coming. Karen tried to regain authority, waving her arms and squawking orders, but the timing of the sprinklers, the shimmering water, and the subtle noises left her flailing helplessly. She was a queen dethroned, her royal proclamations drowned out by laughter, splashes, and the sparkling spectacle that made her realize, This backyard was no longer hers. I couldn't help but smile quietly from my deck. The beauty of this wasn't just in the surprise itself, it was in the revelation. Karen and her family finally understood that entitlement doesn't get you free access to someone else's property. That lesson, delivered with humor, harmless chaos, and a touch of theatrical flair, was far more effective than any argument, polite note, or warning sign. The kids finally scrambled out of the pool, dripping and exhilarated, while Karen glared, soaked to the elbows, muttering about this ridiculous display and neighbors getting involved. Her husband, ever the reluctant participant, shook his head, giving me a faint, knowing smile from across the yard. Even he seemed to realize that this wasn't just a prank, it was a subtle, well-crafted lesson in boundaries. By the time everyone finally left, the pool returned to its calm, pristine state, sparkling innocently under the sun. The sprinkler system was deactivated, the crystals slowly settling to the bottom, and the noisemakers were silent once more. My backyard, once a peaceful sanctuary, had become a stage for a perfectly executed suburban drama, and it had gone exactly as planned. As I sat back on my deck, sipping the last of my coffee, I felt a sense of satisfaction that was almost meditative. Karen's family had been humbled, amused, and taught a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. And the best part, I hadn't raised my voice, yelled, or broken a single HOA rule. My backyard was mine again, not by force, but by cleverness, timing, and a little harmless mischief. I knew, of course, that this wasn't the absolute end. Karen would probably be plotting something subtle in return, an HOA complaint, a passive-aggressive note, maybe even a little social pressure. But for now, I had won the morning, the week, the battle of my backyard. And I knew that when the next confrontation came, I would be ready. Because this wasn't just about water, sprinklers, or sparkles. It was about reclaiming control, about asserting boundaries, and about proving, once and for all, that even in a quiet suburban neighborhood, cleverness and patience could triumph over entitlement. And as I watched the empty driveway, feeling the sun warm my shoulders and the pool glint innocently beneath me, I smiled. The suspense wasn't over, but the first real victory had been mine. Just when I thought my little backyard victory had settled things, I realized something important. Karen never forgets. She's like a storm that simmers quietly before exploding, and I had a front row seat for the brewing tempests. It started on a Monday morning. I was sipping coffee, enjoying the post-victory calm, when I noticed a bright yellow envelope pinned to my front gate. My heart sank a little, not because I feared it, but because I knew the signature on that envelope meant trouble. Sure enough, the moment I opened it, my suspicions were confirmed. A formal HOA complaint. Apparently, my unexpected pool surprises were classified as unneighborly conduct and disturbances to the community. They weren't even trying to hide it. Karen's carefully phrased accusations painted me as the villain in the neighborhood story. I couldn't help but chuckle, though. Her inability to see her own behavior while writing a complaint was almost impressive. But this was different from the past. Now I had to be strategic. I couldn't simply respond with another prank. I needed to show restraint, intelligence, and just the right amount of subtlety. I reviewed the HOA rules carefully. Every clause, every regulation about private property, about noise, about trespassing, meticulously documented. And that's when it clicked. Karen's complaint didn't just expose her bitterness, it exposed her own hypocrisy. I drafted a response, polite but firm. I cited specific clauses proving my backyard was private property, noted the frequency of Karen's family trespassing, and included timestamps I had recorded discreetly over the previous months. Every detail was backed with evidence, leaving little room for debate. I added a hint of humor, a subtle jab without being overt. I'm happy to host anyone who asks permission first. Otherwise, my sprinklers remain fully operational. Delivering the response was almost as satisfying as the previous weekend's chaos. I watched Karen's reaction from a distance, subtle eyebrow raises, a brief pause, and then a muttered, "How did he?" That quiet, simmering frustration was almost artistic. I could practically hear her mental gears grinding, trying to concoct a counterattack that wouldn't make her look ridiculous. And then the escalation began. Karen tried subtle acts of retaliation, nothing overt, nothing illegal. Passive-aggressive notes left on my gate, whispered comments to neighbors, and even attempts to rally a few HOA board members on her side. But every time, I stayed calm, strategic, and precise. I didn't confront her directly. Instead, I let her actions reveal themselves in small, humorous ways that only highlighted her obsession with my backyard. I started noticing the tension building during her family's next unsanctioned pool visit. Karen lingered at the edge of the pool, trying to assert some control, but her family was more hesitant this time. They glanced nervously at the sprinklers and the pool's subtle sparkle, as if aware, on some instinctive level, that the backyard had a mind of its own. And they weren't wrong. Her children were still eager to swim, but even they approached cautiously, whispering to each other, casting furtive glances at Karen as if asking, "Are we in trouble?" Karen tried to lead with authority, but her frustration was palpable, her gestures slightly exaggerated, her voice tinged with desperation. It was a subtle, almost comical dance of control and defeat. I remained on my deck, arms crossed, coffee in hand, savoring the scene. The suspense wasn't just in their reaction, it was in the tension of anticipation. Would Karen escalate further? Would she finally relent? Or would she try some new scheme I hadn't yet predicted? The uncertainty added a delicious edge to every interaction. Over the next few weeks, I noticed the pattern clearly emerging. Karen was gradually losing influence. Her attempts to intimidate, to reclaim control, were met with calm resistance, subtle humor, and quiet assertiveness from me. And the neighbors were starting to notice too. Casual comments, sympathetic nods, even quiet chuckles at the absurdity of the situation. It was clear that my subtle strategy was working. By the time the next Saturday arrived, Karen's family hesitated at the gate. Their confidence had diminished, their boldness was tempered by the realization that this wasn't their territory. And I, watching from my deck, knew that the final act of this suburban drama was approaching. The climax, the moment of ultimate resolution, was just around the corner. Because in this game of wits, patience, and harmless mischief, the last word hadn't been spoken yet. And when it came, it would be unforgettable. Saturday morning arrived with a calm that felt almost too perfect. My backyard sparkled in the sunlight, the pool water glinting like polished glass, and for the first time in months, I felt the thrill of anticipation without the dread of confrontation. Karen's family was due for their usual weekend visit, but this time, there was a subtle hesitation in the air. Something had shifted. I was on my deck, coffee in hand, surveying the scene like a general before the final battle. My sprinklers remained off, the noisemakers silent, and the harmless shimmering crystals settled peacefully in the pool. Today wasn't about chaos or surprises, it was about closure, the sweet satisfaction of reclaiming my space once and for all. Karen's SUV rolled into the driveway, slightly later than usual, and I could already see the tension in her posture. Sunglasses on, clipboard in hand, she stepped out with a rigid precision that made her appear almost statuesque, but I could see it in her shoulders. Even her signature glare was tinged with uncertainty. The kids jumped out, towels draped around their necks, glancing at the pool with that familiar mix of excitement and apprehension. Her husband followed, still cautiously optimistic, as if unsure what the morning would bring. I greeted them with a calm wave, my tone casual. "Morning, beautiful day for a swim, isn't it?" Karen paused mid-step, flustered. Yes, I suppose." Her usual confident stride was replaced by hesitation, and I couldn't help but notice the subtle way her kids exchanged nervous glances. They knew something had changed, they could feel it. This time, I didn't need tricks. I didn't need sprinklers, noisemakers, or sparkling crystals. The lesson had already been learned. Karen's family had realized, without a single harsh word from me, that my backyard wasn't theirs. Their hesitation, the careful way they approached the pool, the subtle attempts to avoid eye contact, it all spoke volumes. I decided to reinforce it gently, humorously, without being confrontational. "You know," I said, casually leaning on the deck railing, "the pool has a way of telling people who's really in charge." I nodded toward the water, perfectly calm and shimmering innocently. It seems to like a little respect these days. Karen's jaw tightened, her lips pressing into a thin line. Her children stifled giggles, understanding the subtle jab without words being necessary. Even her husband let out a small laugh, shaking his head in reluctant amusement. Over the next hour, the family stayed in the pool, but carefully, cautiously, like explorers navigating a territory with invisible boundaries. No cannonballs, no screaming, no reckless floating unicorns. Every move was measured, every glance toward me almost apologetic. And I watched quietly, savoring the satisfaction of seeing them respect my space without me having to say a single harsh word. By mid-morning, Karen finally gave up the fight entirely. She stepped out of the pool, water dripping from her sleeves, and muttered something about needing to reassess the rules of engagement. Her kids followed suit, towels in hand, looking slightly sheepish but mostly amused. Even her husband offered a small nod toward me, as if to say, "Well played." Neighbors began to notice the subtle shift too. Mr., standing across the street with his garden hose, gave me a knowing smile. Mike, my friend from down the block, texted later, "Saw Karen's crew today, priceless. Looks like the pool finally won." I realized then that the story wasn't just about sprinklers or sparkle crystals. It was about boundaries, patience, and strategy. It was about showing that sometimes, the most effective victories aren't loud or confrontational. They're subtle, clever, and executed with calm precision. Karen's family had learned the hard way that entitlement only goes so far, and that respect is earned, not assumed. As I sat on my deck later, coffee finished, watching the calm ripples of the pool, I felt a quiet satisfaction. My backyard was peaceful again, my sanctuary intact, and the drama of the past months had reached a perfect conclusion. Karen, ever persistent, would likely be plotting minor, harmless retaliation in her mind. But for now, the neighborhood had witnessed a subtle, elegant victory. Boundaries respected, sanity restored, and humor preserved. I smiled, leaning back in my chair. The HOA had been entertained. The neighbors had noticed. And I, quietly victorious, knew that sometimes, a little patience, a little cleverness, and a harmless sprinkle of surprise could turn even the most audacious suburban invader into a humbled participant. The pool shimmered in the sunlight, serene and untouchable. And in that moment, I realized something. The story wasn't just about Karen or her family. It was about me reclaiming what was mine, proving that wit, strategy, and calm persistence could triumph in a world of entitlement. And that, I thought, as I took the last sip of coffee, was a victory worth savoring. Every HOA has a story on HOA Headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.